And the Lord said, I myself will bring the flood of water over the earth to destroy from under heaven every living thing that breathes. Everything on earth will be destroyed. All the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of the sky were opened. The water overpowered the earth mightily. All the high mountains under the entire sky were covered. All living beings that moved on the earth perished, and every human being, everything in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, whatever was on dry land, died. Here in chapter 7 of the book of Genesis, God's vengeance is total. As Michelangelo depicts it on the Sistine ceiling, man's last days during the flood were frenzied, desperate, and violent, finding faith with their loved ones, for they could not have had any in him. Marked for destruction in accordance with his will, should not we, as descendants of the survivors, wonder at the punishment of the fallen? Or if we must hold it in our faith that the just did not perish with the wicked? Nine panels cross the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, 9 scenes from the book of Genesis. The last 3 are devoted to Noah. First comes Noah's thanksgiving, then comes the flood itself, and then Noah's drunkenness. Let us look at the flood picture and wonder at how Michelangelo interprets Genesis. When we look at the figures in this panel, where are the obvious sinners? Only one person is doing violence to someone else, and that is this woman with a club on the boat. A man is trying to climb on board, and his weight is threatening to capsize them. And so she picks up her club, and she seems prepared to defend the raft, and she's aided in this by another man. Now, perhaps the sinners who are on the ark itself are prepared to use violent means to assault it. But everywhere else, we see men and women helping each other. And this is strange, because Genesis 6:5 says, the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So if this were so, we would expect to see people forsaking each other, wouldn't we? But here we have an image, one man carrying another to high ground, and the outstretched arms of this pair demonstrates concern for them, a willingness to help. And there is no reason to suppose that they are driven to compassion by family ties. This looks like strangers helping strangers. And on the other side of the rock, a woman is bent over in concern for this man trying to climb up. And a companion of hers also expresses alarm right next to her. And I think the fact that their colors clash shows us that they're not related. I think Michelangelo does that so we know strangers are helping their fellow men and women. On the left foreground, refugees climb in orderly fashion. With civilized patience, they walk one behind the other. They maintain this in the face of the apocalypse. And nearing the top, one young man carries his friend or his brother or a stranger. And this woman climbs a tree, seemingly with the encouragement of these 2 companions in arms. Now, besides the scene on the threatened boat, the only human who is forsaking his fellow man is Noah, walled up, exclusive, in his windowless ark. So this presents a difficulty. Salvini writes, Michelangelo has created the sense of the universal tragedy and universal grief of humanity, here portrayed as suffering rather than punished. Heinrich Pfeiffer says this about this left foreground, these people mounting the hill. He says about them, does Michelangelo intend to say that these people will be reached by the flood? Surely not. And he goes on to say that this is the Holy Family, right here. And whether he's right or not, there can't be any doubt that that is the illusion Michelangelo is making. He must have been prepared for people to see that resemblance. If they saw this woman with this child and with this man, he can expect us to notice that resemblance, especially since the child is wrapped in this soft pink blanket, which is the same color worn by the prophet Isaiah, as well as the seashell-shaped seat of God. How could Michelangelo have made it any harder for us to determine that these 3 have done anything wrong? So it is here that we should look at Genesis again and consider Noah's thanksgiving. On the Sistine ceiling, Noah's offering to God comes before the flood. But in Genesis it happens after, in chapter 8. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind. If this were not the Christian God, these words would be easily and perhaps even conclusively interpreted as remorseful. This is a remorseful God. It is when we are sorry that something happened that we promise not to do it again. In chapter 9 of Genesis, God concludes, For your own lifeblood, I will surely require a reckoning. And then in Genesis 9:6, whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image, God made humankind. Bearing witness to the flood prompts God to attach his justiciable value to the loss of human life. To take a human life is really for the first time turned into a crime theologically here. God continues to remind of his promise, Genesis 9:15. I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature. God has covenanted to place a bare minimum restriction on the scale of his vengeance moving forward. This is a divine Magna Carta, is what it is. So what sort of suffering must God have witnessed in order to come to this conclusion? For our consideration, Michelangelo gives us his flood panel. These are the images that no just God could see without pity. He shows us this through his covenant. Human life is a more important thing than he realized before. It's a big deal to take a human life. This is what made him say, For your own lifeblood, I will surely require a reckoning. For God to indicate that there ought to be a reckoning for taking a human life is a pretty substantial turnaround from his state of mind before the flood. In 6:6, the words are, And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created. He was getting ready to get rid of us entirely. But after the flood, and after he smells Noah's offering, now it's a big deal. Anyone who wants to take a human life, now there needs to be a reckoning. He learned a lesson from the flood. Genesis 9:6, when the bow, and that's as in the rainbow after the flood, is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant. Whenever there is a rainbow after a storm, it is a reminder that God has agreed to keep the rains within those limits which will preserve us. That is the lesson of Michelangelo's flood panel. A remarkable piece, if we turn back to it, where we see this young man carrying another, and it is unclear why it may be that he cannot walk for himself, and yet the face of the one who bears him as a burden is unconcerned with the extra effort, happy even to be of service. We also see an older man carrying a younger one, where we see a woman, an older woman, propping up a younger man. We see the meek bearing the strong. And we know from Condivi that it's possible this is the very first panel painted on the entire Sistine ceiling. So this may have mattered to Michelangelo to show us that imperfect mankind will never again be disinherited from the earth.